I am Chloe, 33 years old and a forensic accountant who has spent a decade piecing together the financial wreckage of other people. But absolutely nothing prepared me for the devastating wreckage of my own family. After my beloved grandparents died in a sudden and tragic plane crash, their lawyer gathered us to read the final will. He looked right past my perfectly groomed sister and my status-obsessed mother to announce that I was the sole heir to a $67 million estate and their sprawling lakeside villa. When my family demanded I hand everything over to them right then and there, I flatly refused. The very next day they came to evict me from the property, but they froze in absolute terror when they saw exactly who was standing beside me on the porch. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against a toxic family who thought your kindness was a weakness. The mahogany-paneled office of Mr. Sterling, my grandparents' longtime estate lawyer, smelled of expensive leather and old paper. The air in the room was thick with a suffocating tension. I sat in a high-backed chair in the corner, holding a cold cup of coffee, while my family occupied the plush sofa in the center of the room. My mother Patricia sat with her legs elegantly crossed, adjusting her pearl necklace every few seconds. Beside her was my older sister Sabrina, the undisputed golden child of our family, checking her reflection in her phone screen. And hovering over them both was Marcus, Sabrina's husband. Marcus was a smooth-talking African-American real estate broker who wore custom-tailored suits and projected an aura of immense wealth, though I knew for a fact his actual bank accounts told a very different story. We were all gathered to hear the final wishes of my grandfather Theodore and my grandmother Vivian. Their private charter plane had gone down just weeks earlier, a tragedy that had shattered my heart into a million pieces. They were the only people in my bloodline who had ever shown me unconditional love, who saw past my quiet nature and nurtured my sharp mind. My parents had always viewed me as an inconvenient afterthought, a practical, boring disappointment compared to the dazzling, socially adept Sabrina. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he opened the thick manila folder. He bypassed all the usual pleasantries and began reading the core stipulations of the trust. My mother leaned forward, a greedy glint in her eyes, already mentally spending the fortune she believed was rightfully hers. Marcus adjusted his silk tie, practically vibrating with anticipation. And then Mr. Sterling dropped the bomb. He announced in a clear and unwavering voice that my grandparents had bypassed my mother entirely. Every single asset, the stock portfolios, the overseas investments, the $67 million liquid trust, and the historic lake house in upstate New York, was left solely and completely to me. For 3 agonizing seconds, you could have heard a pin drop in that massive office. Then, the explosion happened. Sabrina let out a piercing shriek, slamming her heavy Hermes bag directly onto the polished glass coffee table. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "What do you mean it all goes to Chloe?" she screamed, her perfectly contoured face twisting into a mask of pure rage. "That is a mistake. She is nothing but a depressed, unstable outcast. How can she possibly manage $67 million? She must have manipulated them. She must have forced them to sign those papers when their minds were failing." Her words were designed to cut deep, weaponizing the severe bout of clinical depression I had suffered in my early 20s. Back then, my family had treated my mental health struggles as an embarrassing stain on their pristine social record. They had isolated me, mocked me, and told me to just get over it. My grandparents were the only ones who paid for my therapy and stood by my side until I healed. And now Sabrina was using my darkest chapter as a tactic to invalidate my legal competency right in front of an attorney. Before Mr. Sterling could even defend the legality of the document, my mother leaped into action. Patricia lunged forward and physically snatched the copy of the will from the desk, her eyes scanning the paragraphs frantically. "This is absurd," my mother hissed, her voice trembling with poorly concealed panic. "Chloe, sweetie, you have to be reasonable. You do taxes for small businesses. You have absolutely no concept of how to manage generational wealth. You will lose everything to taxes and bad investments in a year." She reached into her oversized designer tote and pulled out a thick stack of papers. They had come completely prepared for a fight. She slammed a pre-drafted power of attorney document onto the table and shoved a gold pen toward me. "Sign this," Patricia demanded, dropping all pretense of maternal affection. "You are going to sign full conservatorship and financial control over to Marcus. He is a professional. Let him manage the estate. Look at how brilliantly he has handled our family assets. He is the one who helped us secure that luxury Manhattan condo last year." I looked at Marcus, who was smirking at me with an infuriatingly arrogant expression. He crossed his arms and offered a patronizing nod, expecting me to fold, just like I always did when we were kids. They really thought I was still that fragile, terrified girl. They had absolutely no idea that as a forensic accountant, I had already run the background checks on Marcus's brilliant investments. I knew the truth about that luxury Manhattan condo. I knew it had been purchased using predatory high-interest loans secretly taken out in my name, effectively ruining my credit score while they lived the high life. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I slowly stood up from my chair, the silence in the room stretching tight like a wire about to snap. I walked over to the glass table, picked up the gold pen, and then I picked up the power of attorney document. My mother smiled, a triumphant, sickening curve of her lips. I looked her dead in the eyes, gripped the thick stack of legal papers in both hands, and coldly ripped them straight down the middle. The sound of tearing paper was the most satisfying noise I had heard in years. I dropped the shredded pieces of their ridiculous demand right onto Sabrina's Hermes bag. "I will see you all at the funeral service," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "And if any of you ever try to hand me a legal document again, I will have you arrested for attempted fraud." I turned my back on their shocked, gaping faces and walked out of the office, letting the heavy oak doors slam shut behind me. My heart was pounding, a rush of pure adrenaline flooding my veins. For the first time in my life, I had taken my power back. But as I stepped out into the crisp autumn air and walked toward my car, my phone vibrated violently in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw an automated text message flashing on the screen. It was an alert from the private security system at my grandparents' lake house. The notification read, "Warning, unauthorized entry detected at main gate. Multiple motions detected in primary living area." I stopped dead in my tracks, my blood running cold. The reading of the will had just ended, but they were already making their move. My family had not just come to the lawyer's office to intimidate me. They had orchestrated a coordinated invasion. I gripped my phone tightly, staring at the glaring security alert on the screen. My family had not just ambushed me at the lawyer office. They had orchestrated a coordinated invasion of my grandparents' estate. I threw myself into the driver's seat of my car and slammed my foot on the gas pedal. The lake house was a 45-minute drive from the city, but my anger pushed me to make it in 30. My mind raced the entire way, piecing together their arrogant timeline. They must have dispatched a moving crew the moment the lawyer appointment began, fully assuming I would meekly sign away my inheritance. As the autumn trees blurred past my window, a bitter memory surfaced. I remembered the exact day I discovered my college fund had been entirely drained. I had worked multiple part-time jobs to secure a partial academic scholarship, only to find out the remaining tuition money my grandparents had set aside for me was completely gone. Patricia had emptied the account to pay for Sabrina and Marcus' lavish destination wedding in the Bahamas. When I confronted her back then, she simply waved her manicured hand and claimed Sabrina needed a proper start in high society, while I could easily take out student loans since my degree was just for accounting. That was the moment I realized I was nothing but a financial stepping stone for her golden child. The heavy iron gates of my grandparents' property came into view, and my stomach plummeted. The thick security chain had been completely severed with bolt cutters. I parked my car sideways across the driveway, blocking the exit of a large white moving truck idling near the front steps. I stormed up the stone pathway, my blood boiling with a rage I had never felt before. The heavy mahogany front door was propped wide open. In the center of the expansive living room, Marcus was barking orders at two men in overalls. They were carefully lifting my grandfather's prized 19th century oil painting off the wall. "Put that down right now," I demanded, my voice cutting through the room like a whip. The movers froze immediately, glancing uncertainly between me and Marcus. Marcus turned around slowly, brushing imaginary dust off his expensive suit jacket. He did not look surprised to see me, only mildly annoyed. "Well, if it isn't the newly crowned heiress," Marcus sneered, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Relax, Chloe. I am just doing an initial inventory of the assets. We are going to renovate this outdated museum and flip it into a high-end corporate rental. You know Theodore always wanted me to expand my real estate portfolio." I stepped further into the room, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. "My grandfather never wanted you anywhere near his property, Marcus," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "Especially not after he had to quietly bail you out of a $200,000 gambling debt in Vegas 3 years ago just to keep loan sharks from breaking your legs." The smug smile instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a flash of genuine panic. He clearly thought that secret had died with my grandfather. Before he could formulate a lie, footsteps clattered down the wooden staircase. Patricia and Sabrina marched into the living room, looking around as if they already owned the place. "What is she doing here?" Sabrina whined, glaring at me. "Marcus, tell her to leave. She is ruining the vibe." Patricia pulled out her phone, her eyes narrowing at me. "I warned you to be reasonable, Chloe," she hissed. "But since you want to play the difficult child, we will handle this the hard way. The paperwork transferring the deed has not cleared the county office yet. Technically, as Theodore's biological daughter, I have primary domestic rights to this property until a judge says otherwise. You are trespassing." She dialed a number she knew by heart. She was calling Sheriff Miller, the local law enforcement officer who frequently attended her upscale golf club dinners. She spoke quickly into the receiver, playing the role of the distressed, victimized mother perfectly. Within 10 minutes, the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser reflected off the large glass windows of the living room. Sheriff Miller walked through the open front door, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. Patricia immediately rushed to his side, pointing an accusatory finger at me. "Officer, thank goodness you are here. My daughter is having a mental health crisis and is trespassing on my late father's estate. We need her escorted off the premises immediately so we can secure the property." The sheriff looked at me with a stern, authoritative expression. "Miss, I am going to have to ask you to step outside. This property is under dispute, and your mother has requested you leave." Marcus smirked, crossing his arms victoriously. Sabrina actually pulled out her phone to record me getting kicked out. I did not panic. I calmly reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick document bearing a prominent blue seal. I did not hand it to my mother or Marcus. I handed it directly to Sheriff Miller. "That is a temporary executorship injunction signed by a federal judge this morning," I stated clearly, making sure everyone in the room heard every single syllable. "It grants me immediate exclusive legal control over all physical properties belonging to the estate, overriding any pending county deed transfers. Furthermore, it designates any unauthorized entry by family members as felony criminal trespass." Sheriff Miller read the document, his face turning pale as he recognized the federal seal. He slowly handed the paper back to me and turned to my mother. "Patricia," he said, his voice entirely stripped of its former friendliness, "you and your family need to vacate this house immediately. If you do not leave right now, I will have to arrest all of you for felony trespassing." The deafening silence that followed was absolute, unadulterated perfection. Now I needed to make my next move. Patricia's face turned a shade of crimson I had never seen before. She grabbed her designer purse, her knuckles turning white, and shot me a glare filled with absolute venom. Sabrina stomped her feet like a spoiled toddler, screaming that her expensive shoes were going to be ruined by the rain outside. Marcus silently signaled the movers, abandoning the priceless oil painting on the floor before storming out the door without another word. I stood on the porch and watched Sheriff Miller escort them all down the long driveway. The heavy rain washed over their luxury vehicles as they sped away, leaving me alone in the massive, quiet house. I locked the newly repaired deadbolts, activated the backup security system, and breathed in the scent of aged wood and my grandmother's floral perfume. For the first time, this house belonged to me, safe from their greedy hands. But I knew my mother and Marcus would not just walk away. They were too deeply invested in their lifestyle, and my grandfather's money was the only thing propping up their crumbling facade. I went to bed that night with my phone on the nightstand, fully expecting a retaliatory strike. It did not take long. The next morning started innocently enough. I drove back to the city, stopping at my usual cafe to grab a black coffee before heading to my forensic accounting firm. When I handed the barista my debit card, the terminal beeped a harsh, declining tone. I frowned, handing her a different credit card. Declined again. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I pulled my car over and opened my banking application. A bright red banner flashed across my screen, stating that all my personal checking and savings accounts were temporarily frozen under a suspicious activity hold. Marcus had struck. He still had extensive connections with corrupt regional bank managers from his shady real estate dealings. He had leveraged a fake corporate compliance claim to illegally lock me out of my own money. He wanted to starve me out, leaving me financially paralyzed before the estate funds could legally transfer into my possession. It was a classic intimidation tactic used by financial abusers, hoping the victim would panic and surrender. He fundamentally misunderstood who he was dealing with. Before I could even call my bank fraud department, my phone started vibrating uncontrollably. Notifications flooded my home screen in rapid succession. Text messages from cousins, aunts, and uncles I had not spoken to in years piled up, each one more aggressive than the last. I opened a message from my Aunt Linda, reading the vicious words calling me a parasite and an elder abuser. Confused, I opened my social media applications. Sabrina had launched a full-scale smear campaign. She had posted a highly edited, tearful video of herself sitting in her lavish living room, wearing no makeup to appear vulnerable. In the video, she sobbed to her thousands of followers, claiming I was an estranged, mentally unstable sibling who had secretly isolated our grandparents during their final months. She accused me of manipulating them into altering their will and violently throwing her and our mother out into a severe storm when they merely tried to gather sentimental family keepsakes. The video already had tens of thousands of views. Sabrina's wealthy friends and our extended family members were sharing it, tagging local news outlets and demanding justice for the supposedly victimized golden child. My phone rang again. It was a local reporter asking for a comment on the allegations of elder abuse. I hung up immediately and turned my phone to silent mode. They wanted me to cry. They wanted me to release a frantic, emotional statement defending myself online so they could twist my words and prove I was unstable. They wanted a chaotic public battle to distract from their own impending financial doom. I refused to give them that satisfaction. I did not shed a single tear. Instead, I drove straight to my office, swiped my secure access badge, and locked myself inside my private suite. As a senior forensic accountant, my entire career was built on dismantling financial lies. I tracked hidden money for a living. I ripped apart corporate fraud, exposed offshore tax evasion, and brought down corrupt executives who thought they were untouchable. Marcus was just a small-time real estate hustler pretending to be a titan of industry. I booted up my encrypted workstation and logged into our firm's advanced financial tracking databases. I bypassed standard protocols and launched a deep dive directly into Marcus and Sabrina's corporate filings, public tax records, and registered shell companies. The deeper I dug, the more the glamorous facade of their life shattered. Marcus had not made a profitable real estate investment in 5 years. His primary holding company was a crumbling house of cards, propped up entirely by predatory bridging loans. I traced a series of suspicious massive wire transfers occurring over the past 48 months. The money had flowed directly from my grandfather's supposedly secure retirement accounts into a web of offshore LLCs registered under my mother's maiden name. Patricia and Marcus had been systematically bleeding my grandparents dry. They had embezzled millions to fund Sabrina's luxury vacations, Patricia's country club memberships, and Marcus's failing business ventures. The $67 million estate was all my grandparents had left because my family had secretly stolen the rest. I downloaded every ledger, every wire receipt, and every fraudulent tax return. The trap was set. I leaned back in my leather office chair, silently staring at the glowing monitors that clearly displayed their undeniable guilt. The digital footprint they left behind was incredibly sloppy, a massive testament to their overwhelming arrogance. They truly believed no one would ever check the ledgers. Marcus thought he could financially ruin me by freezing my small personal accounts today. I smiled coldly as I safely saved the final encrypted file. By tomorrow morning, I would permanently freeze his entire pathetic existence. The glowing monitors illuminated my office as the depth of Marcus's financial depravity unfolded before me. I had already secured the evidence of his embezzlement, but embezzlement was a past crime. I needed a present weapon. I needed to know exactly why they were trying to evict me from the lake house and seize the $67 million estate right this very second. I initiated a secondary sweep targeting the current liquidity of Marcus's flagship real estate firm. I bypassed sanitized public records and tunneled directly into the shadow ledgers he kept hidden behind multiple shell companies. What I found made my blood run ice cold. Marcus was drowning. His entire empire was built on predatory bridging loans and dangerously leveraged assets. He had borrowed $40 million from a major private financial syndicate managed by a ruthless investor named Gordon. The documents on my screen showed blaring red notices. Marcus had defaulted on 3 consecutive payments. The syndicate had issued a final margin call. If Marcus did not produce $40 million by the end of the month, Gordon would legally seize everything Marcus owned, liquidate his assets, and likely refer his fraudulent loan applications to federal authorities. That was the missing puzzle piece. Marcus did not just want the wealth of my grandparents to maintain his luxurious lifestyle. He needed the $67 million to save himself from total annihilation and a lengthy federal prison sentence. Suddenly, a sharp warning siren blared from my computer speakers. A bright yellow banner flashed across my secondary monitor. Unauthorized access detected. Trace route initiated. Marcus had hired a competent offshore cybersecurity team to guard his digital vaults, and they had just noticed my intrusion. A digital cat and mouse game commenced in real time. Lines of code cascaded down my screen as the hostile administrative protocol attempted to lock down the server and identify my internet protocol address. I had less than 3 minutes before they traced the breach back to my specific workstation at the forensic accounting firm. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard with practiced precision. I launched a diversionary protocol, bouncing my connection through 3 dummy servers in Europe to confuse their tracking algorithms. While their security team chased ghosts across the Atlantic, I initiated a mass download of the syndicate loan documents, the default notices, and the contact information for Gordon. The progress bar crawled agonizingly slowly. 70%, 80%. The hostile trace was closing in, breaking through my first 2 dummy servers. 90%. The system alert flashed red warning of an imminent forced network disconnection. 99%. The download completed with a soft chime. I instantly ripped the encrypted flash drive from the port just a fraction of a second before my screens went entirely black. They had locked the system, but they were too late. The blueprint to the total destruction of Marcus was resting safely in the palm of my hand. I slumped back in my chair, taking a deep breath to steady my racing heart. But as the adrenaline began to subside, a new, far more horrifying thought began to form in my mind. The timing of the massive loan default of Marcus aligned perfectly with the sudden tragic plane crash that had killed my grandparents. It was simply too perfect to be a mere coincidence. I plugged the encrypted drive back into a standalone laptop and opened the corporate expense accounts I had just extracted. I filtered the search results, focusing specifically on aviation and travel expenditures. My eyes scanned the endless rows of data until a specific invoice jumped out at me. My grandfather Theodore had always used a premium, highly vetted private aviation company for his travels. It was a strict rule he never broke. But the ledger showed a bizarre anomaly. 2 weeks before the crash, Marcus had utilized his power as the family property manager to cancel the premium aviation contract. In its place, he booked a flight through a notoriously cheap, unvetted charter service operating under a newly formed corporate entity. I quickly cross-referenced the company against the Federal Aviation Database. The charter company had multiple severe safety violations and a documented history of utilizing pilots with expired certifications. The financial trail told a story of pure calculated evil. Marcus had billed the account of my grandfather for the cost of the premium flight, booked the dangerously cheap charter instead, and pocketed the massive price difference to pay off a fraction of his syndicate debt. He had knowingly put my grandparents on a flying death trap to steal a few extra $1,000s. He might not have planted a bomb on that plane, but his deliberate negligence was the exact reason that aircraft plummeted into the ground. It was completely gross negligence bordering on premeditated manslaughter. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. They had not just stolen my college fund. They had not just tried to steal my inheritance. They were responsible for the deaths of the only two people who had ever truly loved me. A cold mechanical calm washed over me, completely replacing the overwhelming grief and the initial shock. This was no longer just a financial dispute or a petty family feud. This was a war for absolute justice, and I was going to be the ruthless executioner. I carefully packed the encrypted drive, my laptop, and all my personal belongings into my briefcase. I walked out of the office building and stepped into the cool, crisp evening air, pulling out my cell phone. I bypassed the standard contacts for my corporate lawyer and instead dialed a direct unlisted number I had acquired during a previous federal audit. It was finally time to introduce Marcus to the real devastating consequences of his actions. I pressed the call button, listening to the dial tone, fully prepared to initiate a hostile corporate buyout that would leave my incredibly toxic family with absolutely nothing forever. The line clicked and a gruff, impatient voice answered the phone. It was Gordon, the notoriously ruthless head of the private financial syndicate holding the massive $40 million debt of Marcus. He was a man who destroyed lives for a living, and I needed him on my side. I introduced myself calmly, not as a grieving granddaughter, but as the newly appointed executor of a $67 million estate. He initially tried to brush me off, assuming I was just another desperate relative begging for a loan extension. He stopped talking the second I casually recited his exact internal margin call deadlines, the hidden interest rates, and the specific offshore shell companies Marcus had used to secure those loans. That immediately got his undivided attention. We agreed to meet at a private members-only cigar lounge in Lower Manhattan within the hour. I walked into the dimly lit, smoke-filled lounge with absolute confidence. Gordon sat in a curved leather booth flanked by two incredibly imposing men in dark suits. I did not flinch or hesitate. The two bodyguards shifted uncomfortably, clearly unaccustomed to seeing their boss challenged by a woman. I slid into the booth directly across from him, placed my encrypted tablet on the table, and pulled up the doctored ledgers I had just extracted from Marcus's servers. I walked Gordon through the catastrophic reality of his investment. I proved to him that Marcus was not simply experiencing a temporary cash flow problem. His entire company was completely bankrupt. Gordon's $40 million investment was days away from evaporating into thin air. His expression darkened as the reality of Marcus's deception sank in. Before Gordon could unleash his anger, I offered him a flawless solution. I told him I would buy the entire debt portfolio of Marcus for $42 million, transferring the liquid assets directly from my grandfather's trust, which my estate lawyer had already cleared for emergency dispersal. Gordon would get his money back with a $2 million premium for his trouble, and I would legally become the sole creditor of Marcus. This was the power of real wealth, the kind my family only pretended to have. I would own his properties, his business, his cars, and his entire future. Gordon smiled a cold, calculating grin that matched my own and reached across the table to shake my hand. The massive legal paperwork was drafted, reviewed, and finalized by his team before 3 in the morning. At 8 in the morning, I walked back into the lobby of my forensic accounting firm. I planned to submit my formal resignation as I no longer needed a corporate salary when I had a multi-million-dollar empire to dismantle and rebuild. But before I could even reach the elevator bank, the heavy glass doors of the lobby flew open. Patricia stormed into the building, flanked closely by Sabrina. They had decided to escalate their vicious smear campaign from the digital world into my physical reality. Patricia collapsed right in the middle of the crowded corporate lobby, launching into a theatrical, Oscar-worthy performance of a weeping, abused mother. She wailed loudly, clutching her chest, screaming to the stunned receptionists and passing executives that her cruel, unstable daughter was trying to render her completely homeless and was aggressively stealing the family estate. Sabrina stood right beside her, holding up her phone to record the entire manufactured breakdown for her social media followers. My firm's senior partners rushed out of their offices, their faces pale with shock. My managing director, a man absolutely terrified of bad public relations, quickly pulled me into a soundproof, glass-walled conference room. He did not bother to ask for my side of the story or request any evidence. He simply stated that the optics of my mother sobbing hysterically in the lobby, combined with the viral social media videos circulating online, were a massive liability to the firm's pristine reputation. He mumbled a pathetic apology about corporate policies, refusing to make eye contact with me. He suspended me indefinitely, effective immediately demanding I hand over my security badge. Through the glass walls of the conference room, I could clearly see Patricia smirking at me. Her fake tears had miraculously dried up the second she realized her sabotage had worked. I did not argue with my boss. I did not waste my breath defending myself to people who valued corporate optics over the actual truth. I calmly nodded, walked over to my desk, and placed my personal belongings into a small cardboard box. I was no longer the vulnerable girl they could manipulate with threats and public humiliation. They truly thought losing this job would break my spirit. They thought stripping away my professional identity would force me to surrender the lake house and hand over the inheritance. They had absolutely no idea that nestled safely at the bottom of my leather briefcase was the countersigned syndicate contract. I did not just have my grandfather's money anymore. I literally owned the roof over their heads. I walked right past my mother and older sister without uttering a single word, stepping confidently into the elevator. As the metal doors slid shut, cutting off the sound of Patricia's fake sobbing, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a text message from Sabrina. She had sent a selfie. In the photo, she was standing on the front lawn of the lake house, bundled in a designer coat, with a massive yellow bulldozer parked right behind her on the grass. The message below the photo read, "The local judge just approved Mom's temporary deed override. We are tearing down this old dump tomorrow at 8 in the morning to break ground on the new resort. Run back to your tiny apartment while you still can. The cops will arrest you if you show your face here." I smiled, tapping my fingers against the cardboard box. Tomorrow morning was going to be a glorious bloodbath. The morning mist hung heavy over the dark waters of the lake, casting a chilling atmosphere across my grandparents' estate, which felt almost poetic given what was about to unfold. I had arrived hours before dawn, bypassing the temporary chain-link fence Marcus had audaciously erected. I sat perfectly still on the wraparound porch, sipping hot black coffee from a thermos. My laptop rested on the wicker table beside me, displaying the finalized documents. The $40 million syndicate debt had cleared at exactly 4 in the morning. I was no longer just a forensic accountant. I was the sole proprietor of Marcus's entire fraudulent empire and the undisputed owner of every single asset my family falsely believed they had stolen. I checked my watch. It was 7:45. The waiting was over. The silence of the morning was shattered by the aggressive roar of heavy diesel engines echoing down the private access road. Through the tree line, I watched as the massive yellow bulldozer from Sabrina's threatening text message lumbered into view. It was followed by a convoy of luxury vehicles. Marcus's sleek black SUV led the pack, trailed by a silver sedan belonging to their corrupt county lawyer and Sabrina's bright red sports car. They parked haphazardly across the manicured front lawn, carving deep, muddy trenches into the pristine grass. The doors of the SUV swung open, and Marcus stepped out, projecting arrogant swagger. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, an unlit Cuban cigar clenched between his teeth. Patricia emerged from the passenger side wearing an oversized designer trench coat and sunglasses, looking ready for an exclusive brunch. Sabrina practically skipped out of her car holding her smartphone high in the air. She was live streaming the event to her followers, narrating her fabricated victim story. "Look who decided to show up for the grand finale!" Marcus sneered, his voice carrying easily over the idling engine of the bulldozer. He sauntered up the stone pathway, stopping just at the edge of the wooden porch steps. He pulled a silver lighter from his pocket and lit his cigar, blowing thick smoke into the morning air. "I told you to run back to your tiny apartment, Chloe. Did you really think you could outsmart me? I have the entire county court system in my contacts list." Patricia stepped up beside him, her lips curled into a vicious smirk. She pulled a folded legal document from her designer bag and waved it in the air like a victory flag. The county judge signed the emergency deed override at midnight. Patricia announced, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "The court recognizes me as the primary biological heir and the rightful executor. This property is slated for immediate commercial demolition. You have exactly 5 minutes to get off my land, or I will have the demolition crew physically drag you to the curb." Sabrina shoved her phone camera directly toward my face, capturing my stoic expression for her eager audience. "This is what happens when a greedy, unstable parasite tries to steal from her own mother," Sabrina said loudly into her phone, performing with practiced, tearful earnestness. "We tried to get her psychiatric help. We tried to be a loving family. But she just wanted the money. Now we finally get to reclaim our grandparents' legacy and build the luxury wellness resort they always dreamed of." The sheer audacity of her lies was staggering. They were preparing to bulldoze a historic generational family home to build a tacky commercial resort, all to desperately liquidate assets and save Marcus from his crushing debt. They thought they had backed me into an inescapable corner. They thought freezing my accounts left me defenseless. I did not raise my voice. I did not attempt to shield my face from Sabrina's intrusive camera lens. I took a slow sip of my coffee. "You are trespassing on private property, Marcus," I said, my voice echoing clearly over the rumble of the bulldozer. "And I strongly suggest you put out that cigar. My grandfather despised cheap smoke." Marcus threw his head back and laughed loudly. The sound grated against my ears. "Your grandfather is dead, Chloe, and his outdated opinions died with him in that plane crash. This is my property now. I call the shots." He turned to the heavy machinery operator sitting in the cabin of the bulldozer and aggressively waved his hand forward. "Fire it up! Take down the front columns first. Let us give the heiress a show." Patricia leaned forward, resting her hands on the wooden railing of the porch. Her eyes were cold, devoid of any maternal warmth. "You never belonged with us, Chloe," she whispered, her tone laced with absolute cruelty. "You were always a stain on our pristine family image, a boring, depressing little accountant who could never measure up to your sister. Hand over the access codes to the offshore trust accounts right now, and I might consider letting you keep a small stipend so you do not starve on the streets." I slowly set my silver thermos down on the wicker table. I closed my laptop, their financial ruins safely secured. I looked directly into my mother's eyes, feeling the last remaining threads of familial obligations snap and dissolve into the cold autumn wind. "I do not need a stipend, Mother," I replied, my voice dropping to a deadly icy whisper, "because as of 4 o'clock this morning, I purchased the entirety of Marcus's $40 million syndicate debt from Gordon. I own the mortgage on your Manhattan condo. I own the deed to Marcus's commercial firm. I own every single asset you possess." Marcus froze the cigar, slipping slightly from his lips. The smug confidence drained from his face in an instant, replaced by a profound, sickening confusion. "What did you just say?" he stammered, taking a step back. Before I could repeat myself, the distant, unmistakable wail of heavy sirens pierced the morning air. It was a beautiful sound. The sound grew rapidly louder, echoing across the lake and bouncing off the surrounding mountains. I checked my wristwatch. It was exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. "Right on time," I smiled, looking past my horrified family toward the main access road. "You see, Marcus? You made one fatal miscalculation when you booked that cheap, unvetted charter flight for my grandparents. You left a digital paper trail. And federal agents absolutely love a good paper trail. Now you face the consequences. That was the devastating reality I dropped on them as the sirens wailed in the distance. But to understand exactly how I engineered their total destruction that morning, I need to take you back 24 hours to the moment my family thought they had broken me. After Marcus illegally froze my personal checking accounts, and Sabrina launched her pathetic social media smear campaign, they fully expected me to crumble. They wanted a messy, emotional breakdown to prove to the world that I was the unstable, greedy daughter they claimed I was. I did not give them a single tear. I silenced my phone, tossed it into the passenger car, and drove directly to the downtown high-rise that housed my forensic accounting firm. The city was just waking up, the early morning light casting long shadows across the empty financial district. I swiped my security badge at the private underground entrance, the glass doors sliding open to grant me access to the one place I held absolute power. My family viewed my career as a boring desk job. They never understood that being a senior forensic accountant meant I was a financial surgeon. I specialized in dissecting corporate fraud tracking, hidden offshore money, and burying corrupt executives under undeniable federal evidence. Marcus was an arrogant amateur playing in a league he could not comprehend. I stepped into my corner office, locked the solid oak door behind me, and powered up my encrypted multi-monitor workstation. The quiet hum of the servers was a comforting contrast to the chaotic noise my family constantly generated. I bypassed the standard employee protocols, elevating my access credentials to the highest administrative tier. I tapped into the secured federal tax databases, the international banking registries, and the corporate filing archives. I was not looking for mere discrepancies. I was hunting for the absolute annihilation of Marcus. I started with his flagship real estate brokerage. On the surface, the company projected immense wealth, boasting a portfolio of luxury commercial properties and high-end residential developments. Sabrina flaunted this wealth, daily posting photos of designer handbags, funded by the supposed genius of her husband. But the moment I pulled the corporate tax filings, the glamorous facade instantly evaporated. Marcus had not closed a single profitable real estate transaction in over 5 years. His corporate income was a complete fabrication. The balance sheets were a disastrous mess of inflated asset valuations and missing revenue streams. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, running a reverse audit on his operating capital. If his legitimate business was failing so spectacularly, I needed to know exactly how he was funding his lavish lifestyle and his payroll. I initiated a deep dive into the routing numbers attached to his primary corporate accounts. The tracking software churned through millions of data points before spitting out a glaring anomaly. The money keeping Marcus afloat was not coming from real estate sales. It was being funneled through a highly convoluted web of shell companies. I isolated the incoming wire transfers and began peeling back the layers of corporate obfuscation. Marcus had registered over a dozen limited liability companies in states with notoriously secretive corporate laws, specifically Delaware and Nevada. He layered these companies inside one another like Russian nesting dolls, intentionally designed to hide the true origin of funds. But forensic accounting is about finding the thread that connects the invisible dots. I ran a cross-reference on the registered agents and the mailing addresses tied to those shell companies. My heart turned to solid ice when the search results populated on my screen. The managing director listed on the deepest, most secure offshore account was not Marcus. It was Patricia. My own mother had used her maiden name to register a fraudulent holding company in the Cayman Islands. She and Marcus were not just business partners. They were co-conspirators in a massive financial crime syndicate. I leaned closer to the glowing monitors, my eyes scanning the transaction dates and the exact monetary values moving through Patricia's hidden accounts. I opened a secondary window and pulled up the financial disclosures from my grandfather's estate, focusing specifically on his private pension funds and long-term retirement trusts. I ran a comparative analysis between the withdrawals from my grandfather's accounts and the deposits landing in Patricia's offshore shell company. The results were an exact to the penny match. A wave of pure disgust washed over me. For the past decade, my grandfather had believed Marcus was helping him manage his retirement portfolio. He had trusted his son-in-law and his biological daughter to protect the wealth he had spent a lifetime building. Instead, Patricia and Marcus had been systematically bleeding him dry. Every time Sabrina bought a new sports car, every time Patricia hosted a gala, they were doing it with money directly stolen from my grandparents. They had embezzled millions of dollars, carefully siphoning funds in increments small enough to avoid triggering automatic federal banking alerts. They had drained their retirement accounts so completely that the $67 million liquid trust was literally the only clean money my grandparents had left. That was the real reason Patricia had desperately tried to force me to sign the power of attorney document in the lawyer's office. It was never about them thinking I was incompetent. It was about pure panic. If I took legal control of the estate, I would gain full access to the historical financial records. I would instantly see the missing millions. They needed to secure the estate to cover their tracks and prevent me from discovering their decade-long embezzlement scheme. I reached for a secure flash drive and plugged it into the encrypted port on my workstation. I downloaded every fraudulent tax return, every offshore wire receipt, and the complete paper trail connecting Patricia and Marcus to the stolen retirement funds. I was building a digital guillotine, and I was going to drop the blade on their entire existence. I stared at the silver flash drive resting in the palm of my hand. The embezzlement evidence was solid enough to put them both behind bars for decades. But something in my analytical mind snagged like a loose thread on a cheap sweater. Embezzlement explained the past decade, but it did not explain the sheer, unadulterated panic of the last 48 hours. Why the aggressive ambush at the lawyer office? Why the desperate illegal attempt to evict me from the lake house before the deed transfer even cleared? Criminals who have been successfully hiding stolen money for 10 years do not suddenly act with such reckless, noisy desperation unless they are facing an immediate catastrophic threat. I plugged the drive back into the secured terminal. I needed the full picture. I pivoted my search away from Patricia and her offshore accounts, aiming my crosshairs directly at the beating heart of Marcus and his commercial real estate empire. I launched a highly restricted background trace on Marcus and his flagship development firm. On paper, and across the carefully curated social media feeds of Sabrina Marcus, was a titan of industry. He boasted constantly about multi-million-dollar commercial acquisitions, luxury high-rises, and expansive corporate parks. However, forensic accounting strips away the marketing gloss to reveal the brutal truth of the balance sheet. I bypassed the sanitized public filings and used a backdoor access portal to pull the raw, unfiltered credit reports and leveraged asset sheets tied to his primary holding company. The numbers populating across my monitors painted a picture of absolute financial carnage. Marcus was not a successful broker. He was a drowning man gasping for air. His company had not generated actual profit in over 5 years. Instead, he had been surviving on a toxic diet of predatory bridging loans, constantly borrowing heavily against overvalued properties just to pay the crushing monthly interest on his previous debts. I tracked the largest, most aggressive credit line on his books. It led me away from traditional banking institutions and straight into the dark, unregulated waters of a major private financial syndicate. The syndicate was notoriously ruthless, managed by an aggressive shadow investor known in financial circles as Gordon. Marcus had borrowed an astronomical $40 million from the syndicate of Gordon, using his entire commercial portfolio as collateral. I pulled up the internal payment history. Marcus had missed his first payment 6 months ago. He missed the second payment 3 months later. I opened the most recent correspondence log between Marcus and the syndicate attorneys. Blaring red default notices filled my screen. Gordon had issued a final margin call. If Marcus did not produce $40 million in liquid cash by the end of the current month, the syndicate would legally seize every single asset he owned, liquidate his company, and leave him with absolutely nothing. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. That was the missing piece of the puzzle. That was the catalyst for their unhinged behavior today. Marcus was facing total financial annihilation. The $67 million estate left by my grandparents was not just a bonus to him, it was his only lifeline. He desperately needed that inheritance to pay off the syndicate and keep himself out of federal prison for the fraudulent loan applications he had undoubtedly filed to secure that cash in the first place. But knowing this and proving it were two entirely different things. To legally weaponize this information, I needed the actual encrypted loan covenants, the signed default notices, and the digital communication logs between Marcus and Gordon. I needed the raw, unedited files stored deep within the private corporate servers of Marcus. I typed a command line to initiate a targeted intrusion into his corporate network. Marcus might have been a terrible businessman, but he had hired a surprisingly competent offshore cybersecurity team to guard his digital vaults. The moment my extraction software pinged his primary server, a sharp warning siren blared from my computer speakers. A bright yellow banner flashed across my secondary monitor. Unauthorized access detected. Traceroute initiated. My heart hammered against my ribs. The digital cat and mouse game had commenced in real time. Lines of hostile code cascaded down my screen as his administrative protocol attempted to lock down the server and identify my internet protocol address. I had less than 3 minutes before they traced the breach back to my specific workstation at the forensic accounting firm, which would give Marcus the legal ammunition he needed to have me arrested for corporate espionage. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard with practiced, frantic precision. I launched a diversionary protocol, bouncing my connection through 3 dummy servers in Europe to confuse their tracking algorithms. While their security team chased ghosts across the Atlantic, I initiated a mass download of the syndicate loan documents, the default notices, and the direct contact information for Gordon. A green progress bar appeared on my screen, crawling forward agonizingly slowly. 10%, 20%. I checked the trace monitor. The hostile signal was closing in rapidly, tearing through my first decoy server in Frankfurt. Sweat beaded on my forehead. If they severed the connection before the download finished, the files would corrupt, losing all my leverage. 40%. 50%. The hostile trace broke through my second decoy server. The system alert flashed bright red warning of an imminent forced network disconnection. I typed furiously, deploying a secondary firewall to slow them down. 70%, 80%, 90%, 95%. The warning siren escalated to a high whine. 99%. The download completed with a soft chime. I instantly ripped the encrypted flash drive from the port a second before my screens went black. The entire blueprint to his total destruction was mine. I slumped back in my leather chair, taking a breath to steady my heart. The adrenaline subsided, leaving a cold clarity. I now possessed the exact weapon I needed to absolutely destroy him. As the adrenaline faded from my system, a new horrifying realization took root in my mind. I sat in the dim light of my office, staring at the silver flash drive resting on the polished mahogany of my desk. I finally had the definitive motive for their unhinged desperation. Marcus was drowning in $40 million of aggressive syndicate debt, and his absolute final deadline was only days away. I looked up at the large paper calendar hanging on my office wall, my eyes slowly tracing the dates backward in time. The final margin call from Gordon had been issued exactly 3 weeks ago. My grandparents had died in that sudden and horrific plane crash exactly 2 weeks ago. The timing was not just a tragic coincidence, it was a perfectly aligned, mathematically precise sequence of events. A cold, nauseating dread pooled in my stomach. Forensic accountants do not believe in random coincidences. We believe in paper trails, hidden financial motivations, and the terrifying lengths desperate people will go to when their entire fraudulent existence is about to be liquidated. I reached into the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a standalone air-gapped laptop. It was a highly secure machine, completely disconnected from the internet, and the firm network guaranteeing that no hostile tracking software or corporate spyware could monitor my next moves. I plugged the encrypted flash drive into the secure port and booted up the operating system. I opened the massive cache of corporate expense accounts I had just extracted from Marcus and his shadow companies. My hands were shaking slightly, which was a highly unusual reaction for someone who had spent a decade clinically dissecting corporate ruin. I ran a custom forensic filter across the raw data, highlighting all outgoing wire transfers, credit card payments, and corporate checks issued during the 30 days leading up to the plane crash. I narrowed the search parameters specifically to aviation travel and logistical expenditures. Rows of sterile data filled my bright screen, hiding the darkest secret my family had ever kept. My grandfather Theodore was a man of strict habits and uncompromising safety standards. For his life, he had utilized the exact same premium, highly vetted aviation company for all of his domestic and international travels. He trusted their flawless safety record, their rigorous maintenance protocols, and their elite roster of veteran pilots. It was a rule he never broke. But as my eyes scanned the digitized ledger, a massive discrepancy glared back at me like a beacon. 3 weeks prior to the fatal flight, right after the syndicate issued their threat, Marcus had utilized his legal authority as the family property and asset manager to abruptly cancel the premium aviation contract of my grandfather. The cancellation fee was astronomical, yet it had been paid out of the accounts of my grandfather without question. In its place, Marcus had generated a brand new purchase order for an entirely different aviation provider. I pulled up the newly generated invoice and compared it against the original banking statements of my grandfather. The numbers simply did not match. Marcus had billed the personal accounts of my grandfather for the full premium cost of his usual luxury flight, but the money had not gone to a legitimate aviation firm. Instead, it had been routed through one of the offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands. From there, a fraction of that stolen money was used to book a flight through a notoriously cheap, unvetted charter service operating under a newly formed anonymous corporate entity. Marcus had pocketed the massive price difference, funneling the cash directly to the syndicate to appease Gordon and buy a few more weeks of breathing room. He had literally stolen the money meant to guarantee the safety of my grandparents. My breathing turned shallow as I copied the name of the discount charter service. I opened a separate secure database linked directly to the Federal Aviation Registry. I needed to know exactly who Marcus had hired to fly that plane. I ran a comprehensive background check on the aviation company Marcus had contracted. The official results that populated on my screen made my blood run entirely cold. The charter service was a shell operation that had been flagged multiple times by federal regulators for severe mechanical safety violations. They had a heavily documented history of utilizing independent contractor pilots with expired certifications, inadequate flight hours, and a complete lack of proper training for adverse weather conditions. They cut every possible corner to maintain their bottom line. Marcus had not just been cheap, he had deliberately placed the two people who loved me most onto a flying death trap, just to steal extra cash to service his toxic gambling debts. He knew the risks associated with that company, and he simply did not care. He traded their lives for a temporary extension on his syndicate loan. The realization hit me with the devastating force of a freight train. They had not just stolen my college fund all those years ago. They had not just tried to illegally evict me from the lake house and steal my rightful inheritance. They had done something far more sinister and unforgivable than simply attempting to silence me through public humiliation and severe economic sabotage. Marcus was directly responsible for the deaths of my grandparents. It was not a tragic, unavoidable accident caused by bad weather or an unpredictable mechanical failure. His deliberate financial negligence was the exact reason that aircraft plummeted into the ground. It was an act of gross negligence bordering entirely on premeditated manslaughter. A cold, mechanical calm washed over me completely, replacing the overwhelming grief and the initial shock I had felt moments before. This was no longer just a financial dispute or a petty family feud over a piece of real estate. This was a war for absolute justice, and I was now the ruthless executioner. I secured the flash drive inside my briefcase. The damning evidence of their greed and the tragic reality of my grandparents' fatal flight were now safely in my possession. If Marcus or Patricia suspected I knew about the fraudulent charter flight, they would immediately destroy whatever secondary evidence remained on their servers. I unlocked my office door and stepped out into the bustling hallway prepared to submit my resignation. I no longer needed a corporate salary when I held the keys to a $67 million empire. Before I could reach the elevator bank, the heavy glass doors of the main lobby flew open with a violent crash. I froze in my tracks as chaotic shouting echoed across the marble floors. Patricia stormed into the building, flanked closely by Sabrina. They had decided to escalate their vicious smear campaign from the digital world directly into my physical reality. Patricia collapsed right in the middle of the crowded corporate lobby. She fell to her knees, dropping her designer handbag and launching into an Oscar-worthy performance of a weeping, devastated mother. She wailed loudly, clutching her chest and screaming to the stunned receptionists and passing executives. She cried out that I had manipulated a dying old man into changing his will and was trying to render my own mother homeless. Sabrina stood right beside her, holding up her smartphone to record the entire manufactured breakdown. She panned the camera around, capturing the shocked faces of my coworkers, making sure to broadcast her fabricated victim story to her thousands of social media followers. "Help us," Patricia sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "My daughter is a monster. She isolated her grandparents and now she is throwing me out onto the street. Please, someone stop her." The entire floor ground to a sudden halt. Analysts and senior partners rushed out of their offices, pale with shock. Our managing director burst through the crowd. He took one look at the hysterical woman on the floor and the smartphone recording every second of the spectacle. Panic washed over his features. He grabbed my arm with a tight grip and pulled me aggressively away from the crowd, dragging me into a soundproof, glass-walled conference room. He slammed the door shut, cutting off the loud wails of my mother. He simply paced the conference room, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Chloe," he stammered, his voice shaking with anxiety. "I do not care what kind of family drama you are involved in, but the optics of your mother sobbing hysterically in our lobby, combined with those viral videos circulating online, are a massive liability. We handle highly sensitive financial accounts for elite clients. We cannot have an employee accused of elder abuse and fraud working on our floor." I stood perfectly still, watching the cowardly man crumble under the pressure of a cheap theatrical stunt. "I can provide complete legal documentation proving those accusations are entirely false," I stated, keeping my voice calm and measured. "My mother is attempting to extort me because she was legally written out of the will. If you review the federal injunction I received yesterday, you will see I am the victim of financial harassment." My managing director shook his head violently, refusing to look at the documents I offered to pull from my briefcase. "It does not matter," he snapped, waving his hands in the air. "The truth does not matter in the court of public opinion. I cannot have cameras in my lobby and police showing up to mediate your toxic family disputes. I am suspending you indefinitely, effective immediately. Hand over your security badge and your corporate laptop. You need to leave the building through the freight elevator right now before the news arrives." I looked through the glass walls of the conference room. As I watched, my mother slowly raised her head and looked directly at the conference room. Our eyes locked through the thick glass. Her fake tears had miraculously dried up in an instant. A wicked, triumphant smirk spread across her face. She knew exactly what was happening inside this room. She knew she had just successfully weaponized my workplace against me. She had aimed to destroy my professional identity, thinking it would leave me destitute, vulnerable, and desperate enough to surrender my inheritance. I turned my attention to my sweating managing director. He extended his hand, demanding my security clearance. I did not argue with him. I did not waste my breath defending my integrity to a coward who valued corporate optics over factual evidence. I calmly reached into my pocket, unclipped my badge, and dropped it onto the table. I placed my laptop right beside it. "You are making a significant mistake," I said, my voice dropping to a cool, steady whisper. "But I accept your terms." I picked up my personal briefcase, holding the encrypted flash drive tight against my side. I walked out of the conference room, moving with a terrifying calmness. I walked right past my mother and older sister without uttering a single word. Sabrina tried to shove her phone camera into my face, demanding a reaction, but I simply stared straight ahead and stepped into the descending elevator. As the heavy metal doors slid shut, cutting off the sound of my mother and sister celebrating their perceived victory, I felt an overwhelming sense of liberation. They truly thought losing this job would break my spirit. They believed stripping away my salary would force me to crawl back to them and hand over the $67 million estate. They had absolutely no idea that nestled safely at the bottom of my leather briefcase was the digital key to their complete annihilation. I was no longer bound by corporate rules or professional etiquette. I was a free agent armed with a massive fortune and the exact evidence needed to send them all to federal prison. The suspension was not a defeat. It was the starting gun. I stepped out of the corporate elevator into the bright midday sun. The suspension from the firm was supposed to be my downfall, but it merely severed the final chain holding me back. I did not waste time mourning the career I had spent 10 years building. Instead, I hailed a black car and directed the driver straight to the upscale legal district. I needed to see Mr. Sterling, my grandparents' estate lawyer, immediately. Mr. Sterling's assistant ushered me into his mahogany-paneled office without delay. He looked up from his paperwork, a mixture of concern and professional curiosity on his face. "Chloe, I didn't expect to see you again so soon. Is everything all right?" I sat down in the same high-backed leather chair I had occupied less than 24 hours earlier when my family first attempted to ambush me. "Mr. Sterling, everything is about to change," I said, opening my briefcase and pulling out the encrypted flash drive. "I have uncovered irrefutable evidence of massive financial fraud and embezzlement orchestrated by my mother and Marcus. But more pressingly, I have evidence that Marcus's entire commercial real estate empire is collapsing under a $40 million debt to a private financial syndicate." Mr. Sterling leaned forward, his professional demeanor sharpening. "Are you certain?" "Absolutely," I replied, my voice hard and unwavering. "And I am not just going to report them. I am going to buy that debt. I need you to unfreeze an emergency dispersal of $42 million from the liquid trust immediately." Mr. Sterling stared at me, processing the magnitude of my request. "Chloe, executing a transfer of that size requires extensive paperwork and judicial approval. The courts move slowly." "Then we must move faster," I insisted, leaning closer to his desk. "This is not a negotiation. It is a financial execution. Marcus is drowning, and if we do not seize his debt right now, he will find a way to drag the estate down with him. My grandparents trusted you to protect their legacy. This is how we protect it." Mr. Sterling studied my face, recognizing the unyielding determination in my eyes. He nodded slowly and reached for his desk phone. "I will assemble the legal team and petition the federal judge for an emergency expedited release of funds. We will frame it as an urgent protective asset acquisition to secure the estate against pending malicious litigation from your mother." While Mr. Sterling mobilized his legal army, I commandeered one of the private conference rooms in his firm. I opened my encrypted laptop and initiated the shadow buyout. I utilized a secure anonymous corporate entity I had previously established for high-level forensic auditing purposes. Through this shell corporation, I reached out to the legal representatives of the financial syndicate holding Marcus's debt. I operated completely under the radar. My family was busy celebrating my professional suspension, entirely unaware that I was actively moving the very chess pieces that would dismantle their entire lives. I received an encrypted communication back from the syndicate's lawyers within the hour. They were intrigued by the sudden offer to purchase a toxic defaulting debt portfolio. I drafted a brutal, non-negotiable contract. I offered them $42 million, a $2 million premium over the principal, in exchange for the complete immediate transfer of all promissory notes, liens, and collateral deeds associated with Marcus's company. The collateral included his commercial properties, his luxury vehicles, and most importantly, his personal and corporate bank accounts. The syndicate lawyers, recognizing a golden opportunity to offload a failing investment at a premium, expedited the review process. We negotiated the final terms through secure channels, while Mr. Sterling battled the federal judge for the release of the trust funds. The hours ticked by, a silent, high-stakes war waged entirely through digital signatures and frantic phone calls. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Mr. Sterling walked into the conference room, a thick folder of documents in his hand. The judge signed the emergency dispersal order. He announced, his voice tight with adrenaline. "The funds are clearing into your secure holding account now." I immediately transferred the $42 million to the syndicate's escrow account. The digital confirmation chimed softly on my computer screen. The transaction was complete. I was no longer just an heir. I was a financial predator, and Marcus was officially my prey. I leaned back in the conference room chair, staring at the finalized transfer documents. My family had spent years treating me like a worthless, depressed failure. They had mocked my career, isolated me, and tried to strip me of everything my grandparents had left me. They thought they were the apex predators, the untouchable elite. They had absolutely no idea that I had just legally purchased the right to destroy them. As I packed my laptop and the finalized contracts into my briefcase, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message was brief and cryptic. "The debt is yours. Good luck with the fallout. Gordon." The head of the syndicate had personally confirmed the transaction. The trap was set and the bait had been taken. I walked out of Mr. Sterling's office, the setting sun casting long golden shadows across the city streets. I felt a profound sense of calm, a chilling serenity that only comes when you know you hold the absolute power of ruin in your hands. I hailed another black car, my destination no longer the city, but the quiet, historic lake house where the final, devastating confrontation would inevitably take place. "What do you think is the best next step to further the story and increase the tension?" I walked out of Mr. Sterling's office, the crisp evening air cooling my flushed skin. The transaction was set in motion, the $42 million transferred, the digital ink drying on the destruction of Marcus. I had legally purchased the very chains that bound him, securing my position not just as an heir, but as his absolute master. But the transaction was merely the foundation. To truly crush him, I needed to meet the man who had previously held his leash. I needed to meet Gordon. Gordon was not a man you simply called. He was a phantom in the financial underworld, a name whispered in boardrooms when desperate executives sought aggressive, unregulated capital. The contact information I had extracted from Marcus's servers provided an encrypted email address and a burner phone number. I chose the phone. The line rang twice before a gruff, heavily accented voice answered. "Speak." "Gordon," I said, my voice projecting a calm authority I had spent years cultivating in hostile forensic audits. "My name is Chloe. We just completed a transaction, $42 million for the debt portfolio of a certain real estate broker named Marcus." There was a pause, a moment of calculated silence as he processed the information. "The new creditor," he said, his tone shifting from aggressive to intrigued. "I was wondering who had the liquid capital and the precise knowledge to execute a buyout that quickly." "I am the executor of the estate he tried to defraud," I stated simply. "I am also a senior forensic accountant. I know exactly how deep his fraud goes, and I know he used your syndicate to stay afloat. The transaction is complete, but I require a face-to-face meeting. Tonight." Another pause. "I don't usually do house calls, Chloe. The business is done. The paper is yours." "The business is just beginning," I countered. "Marcus is currently attempting to illegally bulldoze a $67 million estate to liquidate assets he no longer owns. Tomorrow morning he plans to stand on my property and claim victory. I want you standing next to me when I inform him that you sold him out. I want him to understand that his destruction is absolute, and I want him to know you approved it." A low, rumbling chuckle came through the speaker. "You have a flair for the dramatic accountant. I respect that. Midnight, the Oak Room in Tribeca. Come alone." The Oak Room was exactly what one would expect from a high-end syndicate meeting place. Dark wood paneling, thick cigar smoke, and an atmosphere of quiet, aggressive power. I walked in bypassing the host stand and spotted him immediately. Gordon was a large man, impeccably dressed with eyes that assessed every person in the room as a potential asset or liability. He sat in a curved leather booth flanked by two men whose tailored suits did poorly to hide their muscular builds. I did not hesitate. I walked directly to the booth and slid in across from him, placing my leather briefcase on the table. "You're bold," Gordon noted, gesturing to a waiter who immediately brought over a crystal tumbler of amber liquid. "Most people who owe me money sweat when they sit in that chair. You just bought a massive toxic debt portfolio and you don't even blink." "I didn't buy debt," I replied, ignoring the drink. "I bought leverage, and I am not here to socialize. I am here to finalize the optics of tomorrow morning." Gordon leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I sold you the paper because Marcus was a liability. He was bleeding out and you offered a premium. It was a clean business decision. Why do you need me there tomorrow?" I opened my briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a copy of the forged charter manifest from my grandparents' fatal flight. I slid it across the table. Gordon glanced at it, his expression unreadable. "Marcus didn't just default on your loan," I explained, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "He deliberately booked a notoriously unsafe, unvetted charter flight for my grandparents to pocket the difference and pay a fraction of his interest to you. His financial negligence resulted in their deaths. He killed them, Gordon, and he did it to service the debt he owed your syndicate." Gordon's eyes narrowed. The atmosphere in the booth shifted from cautious intrigue to dangerous tension. In the financial underworld, ruthless tactics were expected, but sloppy, traceable manslaughter was a severe liability. "That is a very bold accusation," Gordon said slowly. "It is a documented fact," I countered, tapping the paper. "I have the wire transfers. I have the reverse audit. I have the complete digital trail. Tomorrow morning I am not just executing a foreclosure, I am executing federal warrants. I have already contacted Special Agent Sterling from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. He will be there." Gordon sat back, a rare flicker of surprise crossing his features. "You brought the feds into this. That is bad business for me, Chloe." "The feds are looking at Marcus, not you," I assured him. "The syndicate transaction is legally sound and fully documented. You sold a bad debt. You committed no crime. But Marcus is going down for embezzlement, wire fraud, and federal conspiracy. I want you there tomorrow because your presence destroys his final illusion of power. He thinks you are his dangerous secret. I want him to see that I own his secret and I own him." Gordon studied me for a long moment. He was a predator recognizing another predator. He understood the value of absolute dominance. "8 a.m., he said finally. "I'll be there. I wouldn't miss seeing that arrogant broker realize he's been played by an accountant." I nodded, snapping my briefcase shut. "Wear a nice suit, Gordon. It's going to be a very public execution." I stood up and walked out of the Oak Room, the pieces now perfectly aligned. Marcus had no escape, no allies, and no future. I hailed a cab, directing the driver to the lake house. The dawn was approaching, and the stage was set for the final act. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window, the image of my grandparents' faces sharp in my mind. I was coming for him, and I was bringing hell with me. The notification pinged on my phone just as I was finishing a perfectly brewed cup of chamomile tea. I was sitting in my apartment watching the city lights begin to flicker on, savoring the quiet calm before the impending storm. The message was from Sabrina. It was a selfie, her face angled perfectly to catch the late afternoon light, a triumphant, gloating smirk plastered across her features. Behind her, resting on the manicured front lawn of my grandparents' lake house, was a massive yellow bulldozer. I tapped the screen to read the text beneath the image. "The local judge just approved Mom's temporary deed override. We're tearing down this old dump tomorrow at 8 a.m. to break ground on the new resort. Run back to your tiny apartment while you still can. The cops will arrest you if you show your face here." I stared at the image, a cold, humorless smile touching my lips. They truly believed they had won. They thought that by leveraging a corrupt local judge and a forged deed, they could simply erase my grandfather's legacy and bulldoze their way to financial salvation. They were so blinded by their own arrogance, so convinced of their untouchable status, that they hadn't bothered to look past the surface. They didn't realize they were already standing in a grave they had dug for themselves. I didn't reply to Sabrina's text. Engaging with her childish taunts would only give her the satisfaction of thinking she had gotten under my skin. Instead, I set my teacup down on the counter and picked up my phone. It was time to make the final arrangements. My first call was to the direct unlisted number I had used earlier. The line connected after 2 rings. "Special Agent Sterling," the voice answered, brisk and professional. "Agent Sterling, this is Chloe," I said, my voice steady. "The targets are moving forward with the demolition of the property tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. They will all be present on site." "Understood," Sterling replied. "We have the warrants secured for Marcus and Patricia, wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The evidence you provided regarding the offshore shell companies and the fraudulent aviation charter was comprehensive. We are moving in. I want them arrested on the property," I insisted. "I want them to understand exactly why their empire is collapsing." "We will be there before the bulldozers start their engines," Sterling confirmed. "Just make sure you are clear of the immediate area when we execute the warrants." I ended the call, a profound sense of satisfaction washing over me. The federal gears were in motion, and there was absolutely nothing my family could do to stop them. But I wasn't finished. I had one more call to make to ensure their humiliation was absolute. I dialed the burner number for Gordon. He answered immediately, the background noise of the Oak Room faintly audible. "Gordon," I said, "the show starts tomorrow at 8 a.m., the lake house. I expect you to be there." "I wouldn't miss it for the world," Gordon rumbled, a dark amusement in his voice. "I want to see the look on Marcus's face when he realizes his debt has a new owner." "Just be on time," I said. "I want the timing to be perfect." With the calls made, I moved through my apartment, gathering the essentials. I packed a small overnight bag, my encrypted laptop, and the leather briefcase containing the finalized syndicate contracts and the federal injunction. I wasn't just going to show up tomorrow morning, I was going to be waiting for them. I drove out of the city, as the sun fully set, the sky turning a deep, bruised purple. The traffic thinned as I moved further upstate, the bright lights of Manhattan fading into the dark, quiet roads leading toward the lake house. My mind was sharp-focused entirely on the execution of the plan. I replayed the sequence of events over and over, ensuring every detail was accounted for. When I arrived at the estate, the property was eerily quiet. The heavy iron gates which they had previously broken were now secured with a temporary chain I had installed. I bypassed it and drove my car up the winding driveway, parking it discreetly behind the detached garage, out of sight from the main entrance. I let myself into the dark house, the familiar scent of aged wood and my grandmother's floral perfume greeting me like a comforting embrace. The silence was profound, a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted here just days before. I walked through the empty rooms, my footsteps echoing softly on the hardwood floors. They had already started packing up the smaller items, preparing for the demolition they believed was inevitable. I settled into the large armchair in the study, positioning myself near the front window, where I had a clear view of the driveway and the lawn. The massive yellow bulldozer sat ominously in the moonlight, a silent threat waiting for dawn. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Adrenaline hummed through my veins, keeping me alert and focused. I spent the night reviewing the financial ledgers on my encrypted laptop, cementing the details of Marcus's fraud and Patricia's embezzlement in my mind. I wanted to be prepared to dismantle every lie they tried to tell, to counter every excuse they offered. As the first hints of gray light began to bleed into the eastern sky, I closed my laptop and packed it securely into my briefcase. I walked into the kitchen and brewed a strong pot of black coffee, the rich aroma filling the cold house. I poured a cup into a silver thermos and stepped out onto the wraparound porch. The morning air was crisp and biting, the mist hanging low over the dark waters of the lake. I sat in one of the wicker chairs, resting the thermos on the table beside my briefcase. The silence of the early morning was absolute, but I knew it wouldn't last. The stage was set. The players were moving into position. I checked my watch. It was 6:30. They would be arriving soon, arrogant and victorious, ready to destroy my grandparents' legacy. I took a slow sip of the hot coffee, feeling a cold, ruthless calm settle over me. I was waiting for dawn, and with it the absolute destruction of the people who had tried to ruin me. The heavy diesel engines roared to life, a mechanical growl that vibrated through the wooden floorboards of the porch and settled deep in my chest. The operator of the massive yellow bulldozer engaged the gears, the steel treads churning the manicured lawn into a chaotic mess of mud and torn grass. I stood perfectly still on the top step of the wraparound porch, holding my silver thermos completely unfazed by the aggressive display of machinery. Marcus stood near the idling SUV, his chest puffed out with arrogant confidence. He waved his hand in a dismissive theatrical gesture, signaling the demolition crew to advance. He truly believed he had won. He believed that the corrupt local judge, the forged deed, and the presence of his pet sheriff were an impenetrable shield. He thought he could simply bulldoze my grandfather's legacy and pave over the truth. The bulldozer lurched forward, its massive steel blade lowering ominously toward the front columns of the house. Beside Marcus, Sabrina held her smartphone higher, her face twisted into a grotesque mask of faux sorrow for her live stream audience. She narrated the scene with practiced tears, claiming they were bravely reclaiming the family estate from a squatter who had lost her mind. Patricia stood slightly behind them, wrapped tightly in her designer trench coat, her eyes fixed on me with absolute undisguised hatred. She wanted to see me break. She wanted me to fall to my knees, screaming and crying, validating every lie she had ever told about my mental instability. I did not give them a single reaction. I did not flinch as the heavy machinery crawled closer. I just took another slow sip of my coffee. Sheriff Miller, who had been lingering near his cruiser, finally stepped forward. He hooked his thumbs into his utility belt, projecting a false sense of official authority. "Miss," he called out, his voice loud enough to carry over the engine noise, "I warned you yesterday. This is your final chance. Step away from the property, or I will be forced to physically remove you and place you under arrest for felony obstruction and trespassing." I lowered my thermos and locked eyes with him. My voice was calm, steady, and cut through the morning air with crystalline precision. "Sheriff Miller," I said, "I suggest you step back and reconsider your involvement in this situation. You are currently acting as an enforcer for a fraudulent eviction based on a forged deed. If you cross this property line, you will not be arresting me. You will be actively participating in a federal conspiracy." The sheriff hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. He glanced back at Patricia, who immediately waved him forward, her expression furious. "Arrest her!" Patricia shrieked, dropping her elegant facade entirely. "She is trespassing. Do your job, Miller." Marcus took a step forward, his expensive leather shoes sinking into the mud. He pulled his unlit cigar from his mouth and pointed it at me like a weapon. "You really don't know when to quit, do you, Chloe?" he sneered. "You think throwing around big words like federal conspiracy is going to scare anyone? You are a low-level accountant. You crunch numbers for small businesses. You have absolutely no power here." The judge signed the order. "We own this land. Now get out of the way before you get hurt." He turned back to the bulldozer operator and yelled, "Keep moving. Take down the porch." The operator hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of advancing the heavy machinery while someone was physically standing on the structure. The engine idled loudly, the massive blade hovering just inches from the wooden steps. Sabrina stepped forward, her phone still recording her voice, shrill and desperate. "Why are you doing this, Chloe? Why do you have to ruin everything? We just want our family home back. Stop being so selfish and leave." The sheer hypocrisy of her statement hung in the cold air. They were the ones who had stolen my college fund, embezzled millions, and orchestrated a fatal plane crash, yet they were calling me selfish. I did not bother to respond to her performative outrage. I simply stared at Marcus, letting the silence stretch until it became suffocating. "I am not leaving Marcus," I said finally, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. And I strongly advise you to tell your crew to shut off their engines. You are making a terrible mistake and the consequences are arriving very shortly. Marcus threw his head back and laughed a loud grating sound that echoed across the lake. Consequences from who you? You have nothing left, Chloe. I froze your accounts. The estate is tied up in litigation. You are broke alone and completely outmatched. Law protects the wealthy, and right now I have all the wealth. You are nothing. Patricia moved to stand beside him, her eyes gleaming with malice. She leaned in, her voice low and venomous. You were always a mistake, Chloe. A boring, depressing little mistake that I had to tolerate. You never belonged in this family. You never deserved any of this. Now hand over the access codes to the offshore trusts, and I might show some mercy. Refuse, and I will make sure you spend the rest of your pathetic life rotting in a jail cell. Her words were meant to destroy me. In the past they would have, but I was no longer the fragile girl she could manipulate. I looked at her, truly seeing the hollow, greedy shell of a woman she was, and I felt absolutely nothing. I don't need your mercy, Mother, I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. And I don't need your money, because as of 4 a.m. this morning I didn't just inherit an estate, I bought your entire existence. Marcus frowned, his cigar slipping slightly. What are you talking about? I didn't answer him. Instead, I raised my wrist and checked my watch. It was 7:58 a.m. I looked past the bulldozer, past my horrified family, and focused on the long, winding access road leading to the estate. I think you should put the cigar out, Marcus, I said softly. Your guests are here. Marcus took a long, deliberate drag from his cigar, the thick, acrid smoke billowing around his face. He looked at me with a mixture of amusement and profound contempt, fully leaning into his self-appointed role as the untouchable patriarch of the family. He genuinely believed that his forged paperwork and his corrupt sheriff had made him a god on my grandparents' lawn. You really don't get it, do you, Chloe? Marcus said, his voice dripping with condescension. He took a step closer, the heavy treads of his expensive leather boots sinking further into the mud he had created. You think you can play games with real money? You think some technicality is going to save you? The rich always win. That is the only rule of the world you actually need to understand. I play the game and I win. You sit at a desk and count the points for the people who actually take risks. You are a spectator, Chloe. And this property, this is the main event. Sabrina stood just behind his shoulder, nodding enthusiastically, her phone still trained on my face. She wanted to capture my humiliation for her followers, eager to broadcast the moment the mentally unstable sister finally broke under the pressure. He is right, Sabrina chimed in, her voice shrill and grating. You have always been so pathetic, always hiding in your room, always reading those stupid financial books. You never even tried to fit in. You just sat there waiting for Grandpa and Grandma to feel sorry for you. Well, they aren't here to protect you anymore. Marcus is taking control, and he is going to turn this place into something actually valuable, something that reflects our family's true status. Patricia, my mother, stepped forward, her designer trench coat contrasting sharply with the chaotic scene of the idling bulldozer and the muddy lawn. She looked at me not with anger, but with a terrifying, absolute coldness. The kind of coldness that only a narcissist can muster when they are about to deliver the final killing blow to their victim's psyche. She stepped so close I could smell the expensive, cloying perfume she always wore. The same perfume she had worn the day she drained my college fund. She lowered her voice, ensuring only I could hear the full venom of her words over the rumble of the heavy machinery. You want to know the truth, Chloe? Patricia whispered, her eyes locking onto mine. You were always a mistake, a boring, depressing little mistake that I had to tolerate. You never belonged in this family. You were never truly one of us. You lacked the ambition, the grace, the simple understanding of what it takes to maintain our legacy. Theodore and Vivian indulged you because they were weak, because they felt guilty for how plain and inadequate you turned out. But I am not weak, and I will not allow you to drag my family down just because you are too stubborn to accept your place. She reached out and placed a single manicured finger on my shoulder, a gesture that looked maternal from a distance but felt like a physical threat up close. Hand over the access codes to the offshore trusts right now, Patricia demanded, her voice a low, steady hiss. Do it, and I might show some mercy. I might let you keep a small stipend so you don't starve on the streets. Refuse, and I will make sure you spend the rest of your pathetic life rotting in a jail cell for elder abuse. I will destroy your career, your reputation, and whatever is left of your miserable life. You will be nothing." Her words were designed to obliterate me. In the past, they would have succeeded. For years, I had allowed her to dictate my worth. I had internalized her cruelty, believing that my quiet nature and analytical mind were somehow defects. I had let her convince me that I was unworthy of love, of success, of family. But standing on the porch of the home my grandparents had built, armed with the undeniable truth of her crimes, her words lost all their power. I looked at her truly, seeing the hollow, greedy shell of a woman she was, and I felt absolutely nothing. No fear, no sorrow, only a profound, chilling clarity. "I don't need your mercy, Mother," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "And I don't need your money, because as of 4 a.m. this morning, I didn't just inherit an estate. I bought your entire existence." Marcus frowned, his cigar slipping slightly. He glanced at Patricia, then back at me, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his arrogant features. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice losing its mocking edge. I didn't answer him. I didn't owe him an explanation. I raised my wrist and checked my watch. The second hand ticked precisely to 8 a.m. The deadline had arrived. I looked past the massive yellow bulldozer, past my horrified mother, my gaping sister, and my confused brother-in-law. I focused my gaze on the long winding access road leading to the estate gates. The road was currently empty, but I knew what was coming. "I think you should put the cigar out, Marcus," I said softly, my voice carrying easily over the idling engine. "Your guests are here." The low rumble of this bulldozer was suddenly swallowed by a much deeper, more menacing sound. From the far end of the tree-lined access road, a fleet of 6 matte black armored SUVs tore around the bend. They moved with aggressive military precision, traveling far too fast for a casual morning visit. The convoy kicked up a massive cloud of gravel and autumn leaves, tearing through the remaining sections of the temporary chain-link fence Marcus had erected. They swarmed the property, fanning out across the manicured lawn. 2 of the massive vehicles skidded to a halt directly in front of the yellow bulldozer, completely cutting off its path to the porch. The remaining 4 SUVs boxed in Marcus's luxury vehicles, creating an impenetrable barricade of reinforced steel and tinted glass. The message was explicitly clear. Nobody was leaving this estate. The sudden, overwhelming display of force instantly drained the blood from my family's faces. Sabrina let out a high-pitched gasp, her smartphone slipping from her manicured fingers and tumbling into the wet mud. She did not even try to retrieve it. Patricia stumbled backward, her designer heels sinking into the soft earth, instinctively clutching Marcus's arm for support. Marcus himself stood frozen, the cigar still dangling limply from his lips, his arrogant swagger entirely replaced by deer-in-headlights panic. Sheriff Miller, who had been standing nearby with his chest puffed out just moments ago, took one look at the government license plates mounted on the front bumpers of the incoming fleet. He recognized the heavy tactical modifications on the vehicles. He recognized the distinct, terrifying presence of federal authorities. The corrupt local official instantly realized he was standing on the wrong side of a very dangerous line. Miller physically backed away from my family, raising his hands at his sides to clearly demonstrate he was not a threat and not affiliated with their fraudulent operation. He slinked toward his cruiser, desperately trying to render himself invisible. The heavy doors of the armored vehicles swung open simultaneously. A dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers with bright yellow letters stamped across their backs poured out onto the lawn. They moved efficiently, securing the perimeter and instructing the terrified bulldozer operator to turn off his engine and step down from the cabin. The heavy machinery sputtered into total silence, leaving only the sound of slamming car doors and the heavy crunch of tactical boots on gravel. From the lead SUV, a tall, sharply dressed man stepped out. Special Agent Sterling of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division radiated absolute, unyielding authority. He adjusted his dark tie, his eyes scanning the scene with clinical detachment, holding a thick leather folder tucked securely under his arm. Immediately following him, the rear door of the second vehicle opened. Gordon stepped out into the morning light. The head of the private financial syndicate looked every bit the ruthless predator I had met in the Oak Room. He wore an immaculate midnight blue suit that stretched across his broad, imposing shoulders. His presence brought a different kind of terror to the lawn. While Agent Sterling represented the inescapable crush of the federal justice system, Gordon represented the brutal, unforgiving reality of the financial underworld. He was the man Marcus had been hiding from the man Marcus owed $40 million, and the very last person Marcus ever expected to see standing in my grandfather's driveway. Agent Sterling and Gordon did not spare a single glance for Patricia or Sabrina. They walked straight past Marcus, completely ignoring his panicked, wide-eyed stare. They climbed the wooden steps of the porch with purposeful strides and came to a stop directly beside me. Sterling took his position on my right, representing the full, crushing weight of the United States government. Gordon took his position on my left, representing the absolute annihilation of Marcus's financial empire. I stood in the center, flanked by the two most dangerous men my family could ever possibly encounter. I took another leisurely sip of my coffee, savoring the warmth, as the crisp morning wind whipped across the porch. The dynamic of the entire world had just violently shifted. The predators who had spent my entire life making me feel small, worthless, and powerless were now looking up at me from the mud. Marcus finally managed to pull his cigar from his mouth, his hands trembling visibly. His eyes darted frantically between Gordon and the federal agents swarming the property. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked, reduced to a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze. Gordon Marcus stammered, taking a hesitant step forward. "Gordon, what are you doing here? We had an agreement. I told your lawyers I was securing the collateral today. I have the deed. I am getting your money." Gordon did not smile. He simply stared down at Marcus with the cold, dead eyes of a shark examining a bleeding fish. "You do not have an agreement with me anymore, Marcus," Gordon replied, his deep rumbling voice carrying easily across the silent lawn. "Your paper is no longer my concern. I am just here to enjoy the scenery and watch the new owner clean up the trash." Patricia, still failing to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster unfolding around her, turned her fury back toward me. "Chloe," she screeched, her voice cracking with hysteria. "What is the meaning of this? Who are these people? You cannot just call a private security firm to intimidate us. I have a court order. I am the executor." Agent Sterling stepped forward, looking down at my mother with a mixture of professional disgust and legal absolute. "Patricia," he stated, his voice ringing with the finality of a judge delivering a death sentence. "You are not the executor. You are a federal suspect. And the paperwork you submitted to the county court last night was the final mistake you will ever make as a free woman." Patricia stared at Agent Sterling, her mouth opening and closing silently as her brain failed to process the words "federal suspect." She looked at the forged deed clutched in her hand, realizing it was not a weapon, but a signed confession. Marcus turned his panicked gaze away from the agents and focused entirely on the syndicate boss, believing money could still buy his salvation. Gordon Marcus pleaded, his voice cracking under the strain. "Listen to me. Whatever this is, we can fix it. You know I am good for the money. I just need a few days to clear the bureaucratic red tape. I can liquidate this property and have your $40 million wired to your accounts by Friday. Just call off your dogs and let my crew finish the demolition." Gordon did not move. He stood on the porch, a towering monument of financial ruin, and let out a harsh, barking laugh that made Marcus physically flinch. "You really are a special kind of stupid, Marcus," Gordon said, his deep voice carrying a terrifying amusement. "You think I brought federal agents to collect a late payment? I do not care about your real estate deals, and I certainly do not care about this lake house. You are bleeding cash. Your company is a shell, and you are a liability. I do not do business with liabilities." Marcus swallowed hard, sweat dripping down his forehead. "But the $40 million," he stammered, taking a desperate step forward. The bridging loans. I put up my entire commercial portfolio as collateral. If you force a margin call right now, you will bankrupt me. Gordon smiled, exposing his teeth like a wolf closing in on its prey. I am not forcing a margin call, Marcus, he replied smoothly, because I do not own your debt anymore. I sold your paper at a premium last night. Every single promissory note, every lien, every collateral deed. I got paid in full in cash before sunrise. The color completely drained from Marcus. He looked like a man who had just been told his parachute was packed with anvils. Sold it, Marcus whispered, his eyes darting frantically around the yard. To who? Who would buy $40 million of distressed debt in the middle of the night? Gordon did not answer with words. He simply turned his head and looked directly at me. Marcus followed his gaze. He stared at me standing on the porch holding my silver thermos, completely unbothered by the morning chill. His brain actively fought against the reality of the situation. But as he looked at my calm, deadpan expression, the horrifying truth finally pierced through his impenetrable arrogance. You, Marcus choked out, pointing a trembling finger at me. No, that is impossible. You do not have $40 million in liquid cash. I stepped forward, moving right to the edge of the wooden steps. I do not have $40 million, Marcus, I said, my voice sharp and clear. I transferred $42 million from my grandfather's trust to Gordon's escrow account at 4 o'clock this morning. I paid a $2 million premium to ensure the transaction was expedited. I bought your debt. All of it. Marcus stood paralyzed. The unlit Cuban cigar he had been chewing on simply slipped from his slack jaw and fell into the mud, joining his shattered pride. Let me be very clear about what this means. I continued, ensuring every word landed like a physical blow. You put up your entire life as collateral for those syndicate loans. Since you are in severe documented default, I am legally executing the forfeiture clauses immediately. I own your commercial real estate firm. I own the luxury Manhattan condo you bought with my stolen college fund. I own your sleek black SUV sitting in my driveway. I own your personal checking accounts and your business assets. As of this exact second, you are entirely irrevocably bankrupt. You possess absolutely nothing. Marcus let out a strangled, pathetic sound. He looked down at his expensive tailored suit, suddenly realizing it was currently owned by the sister-in-law he had spent years mocking. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to lean against the hood of his now repossessed vehicle just to stay upright. The alpha male facade he had meticulously crafted had been violently stripped away, leaving behind a terrified, penniless fraud. Behind him, Sabrina finally processed the gravity of the situation. Her brain, which normally only operated in terms of social media engagement and luxury shopping trips, short-circuited. The realization that she was no longer a wealthy socialite hit her with devastating force. She was not just losing her inheritance. She was losing her current home, her cars, her designer wardrobe, and her entire identity. Sabrina dropped to her knees in the wet grass. Her chest began to heave erratically. She clutched at the collar of her expensive coat, gasping for air, as a full-blown panic attack seized her. Her perfect camera-ready makeup ran down her face in dark, muddy streaks. She let out a loud, high-pitched wail, grabbing handfuls of her own hair. Marcus Sabrina screamed between ragged, hyperventilating gasps. Tell her she is lying. Tell her we still have the money. We cannot be broke. My credit cards, the country club. Marcus, do something. But Marcus could not do anything. He just stared blankly at the cold mud covering his expensive leather shoes. Patricia watched her golden child collapsing on the wet lawn, completely powerless to intervene in the disaster. I stood above them all, feeling no pity, no remorse, and no guilt. They had built their fragile, glamorous world on a foundation of lies, theft, and cruelty. I had simply removed the foundation. The instant bankruptcy was a devastating reality check, but it was only the beginning of their punishment. The real consequences were still waiting for them in the thick leather folder tucked securely under Agent Sterling's left arm. Agent Sterling stepped forward, taking his cue. The crisp rustle of the thick leather folder opening sounded louder than the idling engines of the tactical vehicles surrounding us. He withdrew a stack of formal documents topped with the unmistakable seal of a federal magistrate. The cold morning breeze caught the edges of the heavy paper, but Sterling gripped them with absolute authority. He looked down at Patricia and Marcus, who were still reeling from the financial execution they had just endured. They had absolutely nowhere to run and no money left to hide behind. Marcus Vance, Agent Sterling announced, his voice projecting across the lawn like a gavel striking wood. I am placing you under arrest. Marcus snapped his head up, his eyes bloodshot and wide. He had just lost his company and his wealth, but the word arrest triggered a completely different primal kind of terror. He raised his hands defensively, his voice trembling. Arrest for what? I just lost my business. That is a civil matter. Gordon and Chloe just took my assets. You cannot arrest a man for defaulting on a corporate loan. This is a massive misunderstanding. You are not being arrested for defaulting on a loan. Agent Sterling replied, his expression entirely devoid of sympathy. You are being indicted on 73 counts of federal wire fraud and systemic embezzlement. We have fully authenticated digital records proving you and your mother-in-law siphoned millions of dollars from the private pension funds of Theodore and Vivian over the last decade, routing the stolen capital through shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Your offshore accounts have been seized. Marcus stumbled backward, hitting the side of the repossessed SUV. His chest heaved violently. He looked at Patricia, silently begging her to intervene, to use her upper-class privilege to make the federal agents disappear. But Patricia was frozen, her perfectly manicured hands trembling at her sides. Agent Sterling stepped closer to Marcus, closing the distance. But the financial crimes are just the preamble, Marcus. The most severe charge on this warrant is federal conspiracy resulting in death. The entire estate fell deathly silent. Even Sabrina stopped her hyperventilating sobs, looking up from the mud. We secured the flight manifests and the corporate routing numbers. Sterling continued, delivering each word with lethal precision. You canceled an approved premium aviation contract and deliberately booked your in-laws on a severely compromised, unvetted charter flight to pocket the price difference. You knowingly placed them in a fatal situation to service your illicit syndicate debts. That elevates your financial crimes to federal manslaughter. Marcus collapsed onto the wet grass, his legs completely giving out. The reality of his impending imprisonment crushed the remaining breath from his lungs. He buried his face in his hands, letting out a guttural sound of absolute despair. Patricia, sensing the rapidly closing walls, frantically tried to distance herself from her son-in-law. She straightened her posture, smoothing down her designer trench coat, and adopted an expression of outraged innocence. Officer, I had absolutely no idea about the airplane, Patricia declared, her voice dripping with artificial outrage. Marcus handled all the travel arrangements. He managed the business accounts. I am just a grieving daughter trying to protect my family home. You cannot possibly hold me responsible for his disgusting actions. Agent Sterling turned his icy gaze away from Marcus and focused entirely on my mother. He pulled a secondary document from his leather folder. Do not insult my intelligence, Patricia, Agent Sterling stated. We have the wire transfers bearing your digital signature. We have the offshore accounts registered under your maiden name. You are fully indicted as a co-conspirator in the massive embezzlement scheme. Patricia took a defiant step backward, shaking her head. That is circumstantial. You have no hard proof that I personally authorized those transfers. My legal team will tear those allegations apart in court. I am the biological heir. I have the deed to this property right here. She aggressively thrust the folded legal document toward Agent Sterling. The local judge signed this override at midnight. I watched her dig her own grave, feeling a profound sense of closure. She was so blinded by her arrogance that she could not recognize the fatal trap she had just triggered. Agent Sterling did not take the paper from her hand. He simply stared at it. Patricia, did you submit that deed to the county clerk through the electronic filing portal last night? Yes, I did, Patricia snapped, lifting her chin triumphantly. And the judge approved it. You are trespassing. That deed contains the forged signature of Theodore Sterling, stated, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. Chloe and her legal team provided the authenticated original trust documents to a federal judge hours ago. By electronically submitting a forged property deed across state network lines to seize a federally protected multi-million-dollar trust, you committed felony wire fraud and perjury. Patricia lost her triumphant expression instantly. The piece of paper in her hand suddenly looked like a live explosive. She dropped it onto the wet grass, but the damage was permanently done. "That fake deed is the final nail in your coffin," Patricia Sterling said. "It proves malicious intent to defraud the estate. You handed us the weapon." Agent Sterling raised his hand, signaling the tactical team. 4 federal agents stepped forward, pulling heavy steel handcuffs from their utility belts. The metallic clinking sound echoed loudly in the crisp morning air. Patricia Sterling announced, pulling her arms forcefully behind her back. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Patricia began thrashing wildly, completely losing her aristocratic composure. She kicked at the mud, screaming my name, demanding I stop them. "Chloe, tell them to stop. I am your mother. You cannot just let them take me away to rot in a federal prison. Save me right now, I beg you." I stood on the top step of the porch, the steaming thermos of coffee warm in my hands, and watched the total chaotic breakdown of my family. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked into place around my mother's wrists, the sharp metallic sound cutting through her frantic wails. Patricia, who had spent her entire life meticulously curating an image of upper-class elegance and untouchable superiority, was now thrashing in the mud, her designer trench coat ruined, screaming like a cornered animal. "This is his fault!" Patricia shrieked desperately, twisting away from the federal agent attempting to read her rights. She violently jerked her head toward Marcus, her eyes wide with a manic, terrifying betrayal. Marcus did this. He orchestrated the entire embezzlement scheme. He was the one who controlled the offshore shell companies. I was just following his advice. I am a victim here. You cannot arrest a grieving daughter for trusting her son-in-law. Marcus, who was currently being slammed face first against the hood of his repossessed black SUV, turned his head to glare at her. His cheek was pressed hard against the cold metal, but the venom in his voice was unmistakable. "You lying, greedy witch!" he spat out, struggling against the 2 agents pinning his arms behind his back. "You demanded those transfers. You needed millions to pay for your country club dues and Sabrina's luxury vacations because my real estate business was tanking. You pushed me to find more money. You helped forge that deed. We go down together, Patricia." The federal agents ignored their petty, vicious infighting. They efficiently locked the handcuffs on Marcus, yanking him upright and dragging him toward the back of an armored transport vehicle. He stumbled over the deep tracks the bulldozer had carved into the lawn, his expensive tailored suit smeared with wet dirt. As he passed Gordon, who was watching the scene with quiet, predatory amusement, Marcus desperately called out to him. "Gordon, please. You have the collateral. You own my company now. Talk to them. Make a deal." Gordon simply shook his head slowly. "I own the ashes of your company, Marcus. And I don't negotiate for criminals. Enjoy federal lockup." The heavy metal door of the transport vehicle slammed shut behind Marcus, sealing his fate. Patricia was forcefully escorted to a separate vehicle, her wailing escalating to a high-pitched, hysterical scream. She continued to call my name, alternating between vicious curses and pathetic pleas for mercy, begging me to call off the agents, demanding I remember my duty as a daughter. I did not move. I did not blink. I simply watched the doors close on her, severing her completely from my world. With her husband and her mother locked in the back of federal transport vehicles, Sabrina was left entirely alone on the muddy lawn. She was still on her knees, her breath coming in ragged, hyperventilating gasps. The reality of her sudden catastrophic downfall had finally penetrated her self-obsessed bubble. She was not just losing her inheritance, she was losing the only safety nets she had ever known. Her husband was going to federal prison. Her mother was going to federal prison. Her home, her cars, her credit cards, and her entire identity had been wiped out by a single forensic audit and a hostile debt buyout. Sabrina looked up at me. her face streaked with ruined expensive makeup. She slowly crawled forward through the wet grass, abandoning the dropped smartphone she had used to try and ruin my life just 20 minutes earlier. She reached the bottom step of the porch and looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. The arrogant, spiteful golden child who had spent decades mocking my career, my clothes, and my mental health was now literally begging at my feet. "Chloe," Sabrina sobbed, her voice a pathetic, trembling whisper. "Chloe, please. You have to help me. I don't have anywhere to go. The house is gone. The accounts are frozen. Marcus. Marcus is going to jail. I have nothing. Please let me stay here. Just for a few nights. Just until I figure things out. I'm your sister Chloe. We are blood. Please don't throw me out onto the street." She reached out a trembling hand, attempting to grasp the hem of my trousers. I took a deliberate, measured step backward, moving just out of her reach. I looked down at her not with anger, but with absolute chilling apathy. "You aren't my sister, Sabrina," I said, my voice quiet, steady, and sharp as crushed glass. "You are an accomplice to the people who stole my college fund, embezzled my grandparents' retirement, and sent them to their deaths on a discount charter flight just to cover your shopping debts. You filmed me in my office yesterday hoping to destroy my career and drive me to suicide so you could claim this estate. You stood on this lawn an hour ago and cheered while a bulldozer threatened to destroy my grandfather's legacy." Sabrina shook her head violently, tears pouring down her muddy face. "I didn't know about the plane. I swear, Chloe, I didn't know Marcus did that. I just wanted the money. I just wanted my life back. Please, you have $67 million. You can spare a little to help me. You can't be this cruel." "Cruelty is manipulating an elderly couple for a decade," I replied coldly. "Cruelty is abandoning your daughter to fund your lifestyle. What is happening right now isn't cruelty, Sabrina. It is accounting. It is balancing the ledger. You spent your entire life spending money you didn't earn, stolen from people who actually loved you. Now the bill is due." I took a final sip of my coffee, the liquid still warm despite the cold morning air. I looked past her toward the federal vehicles that were beginning to turn around on the gravel driveway, preparing to transport Patricia and Marcus to the holding facility. "Run back to your empty, repossessed house, Sabrina," I instructed her, my voice dropping to a final deadly whisper. "Pack whatever clothes you bought before the fraud charges clear. Find a job. Learn how to survive on a minimum wage. Because if I ever see you near my property again, I will have Sheriff Miller arrest you for trespassing. And he will do it because he knows exactly who signs his checks now." I turned my attention to the armored vehicles holding the masterminds of my family's corruption. I knew Patricia could likely see me through the tinted windows. I raised my voice just enough to ensure the finality of my words carried across the chaotic scene. "Pay for the $67 million with your life in prison." 1 month later, the dust had finally settled over the absolute wreckage of my biological family. The federal justice system moves with terrifying efficiency when presented with an airtight forensic paper trail. Patricia and Marcus were both denied bail, deemed high flight risks, given their extensive offshore connections. They sat in separate federal holding facilities awaiting trials that their court-appointed public defenders privately admitted were entirely unwinnable. The official indictments came down heavy and merciless. Wire fraud, embezzlement, federal conspiracy, and manslaughter. The prosecutors were seeking 20-year mandatory minimum sentences for both of them. There would be no plea deals. There would be no luxury minimum security camps. They were going to spend the rest of their natural lives surrounded by concrete walls and iron bars, entirely stripped of the wealth and status they had killed to maintain. Gordon had moved with equal brutality, liquidating the ashes of his commercial real estate firm within days. The sleek black cars, the luxury Manhattan condo, the country club memberships, everything was seized, auctioned off, or transferred to my holding accounts. They were absolutely ruined forever. Sabrina experienced a completely different kind of prison. With his assets federally frozen and my mother having her bank account seized, Sabrina was instantly rendered destitute. She was evicted from her sprawling suburban estate with only the clothes she could fit into 2 duffel bags. Her so-called high society friends, the people who had eagerly shared her tearful smear campaign against me, dropped her the very second the federal indictments hit the evening news. They blocked her number, ignored her desperate pleas for loans, and pretended they had never associated with a family of embezzlers. I drove past a local fast food drive-thru a few weeks later, purely out of curiosity. Through the greasy glass window I saw her. Sabrina, the former golden child who had once mocked my career and demanded my inheritance, was wearing a polyester uniform and a paper visor. She was frantically punching buttons on a cash register, while a frustrated customer yelled at her for getting a meal order wrong. Her manicured nails were chipped, her face was exhausted, and the arrogant smirk was permanently erased. She had finally learned the actual value of a hard-earned dollar. It was a fitting punishment indeed. I did not feel sorry for any of them. I felt a profound overarching peace. I sat on the private wooden dock of my family lake house, letting the cool morning breeze wash over me. The water was perfectly calm, reflecting the bright autumn sky like a flawless mirror. The heavy yellow bulldozer that had threatened to destroy this beautiful sanctuary was long gone, leaving only a patch of replanted grass that was already beginning to heal. Mr. Sterling sat in a folding chair beside me, handing me a thick stack of legal documents. I took the silver fountain pen he offered and signed my name on the bottom line. I was not signing a power of attorney or a forged deed. I was signing the official charter for the Theodore and Vivian Memorial Scholarship Fund. I had allocated $20 million from the estate to establish a permanent academic endowment. The fund would provide full academic rides for underprivileged students pursuing degrees in forensic accounting and financial law. Their beautiful legacy would not be defined by the greed of their daughter. It would be defined by education opportunity and the ruthless pursuit of unwavering truth. This was a real victory. Mr. Sterling packed the signed documents into his briefcase, shook my hand with deep respect, and walked back up the hill, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I looked out across the pristine lake, taking a deep breath of the clean, fresh air. For 33 years, I had allowed the accident of my genetics to dictate my self-worth. I had believed the toxic lie that blood ties required unconditional loyalty, even when that blood was poisonous. But family is not a biological obligation. True family is not composed of the people who demand your compliance while secretly draining your resources and belittling your achievements. True family consists of the people who stand beside you in the mud, who respect your boundaries, and who never sell you out for their own financial comfort. I had to burn my biological family to the ground to finally realize my own formidable strength. They thought my kindness was a pathetic weakness. They thought my quiet nature meant I was defenseless and easy to manipulate. They never understood that while they were busy playing dress-up in stolen clothes, I was meticulously learning how to dismantle their entire world, brick by brick. I was completely unstoppable now. If you have ever been the scapegoat in your family, if you have ever been pushed aside, mocked, or told you are not enough, please hear this message. Your boundaries are your strongest armor. Never let toxic people convince you that setting healthy limits makes you the villain of their story. You have the absolute right to protect your peace, your assets, and your brilliant future. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with a toxic family member to save yourself from their abuse? How did you find the courage to walk away and build your own incredible life? Share your inspiring stories in the comments section below. I read every single one of them. If this journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of surviving narcissistic abuse and finding your ultimate power. Your support helps build a community where victims can become victors. Remember, they might try to bury you under their lies and their cruelty, but they do not know you are a seed waiting to grow into something magnificent. Thank you for watching, and always remember to stand firmly in your truth. I will see you in the next video very soon, everyone. The story of Chloe teaches us a profound lesson. Biology does not automatically guarantee loyalty, respect, or love. For years, she endured her family's toxic manipulation, falsely believing she had to accept their cruelty simply because they were blood. However, she ultimately realized that true empowerment comes from establishing unbreakable boundaries. You do not owe your peace, your assets, or your future to people who exploit your kindness and view you as a stepping stone. Protecting yourself isn't selfish, it's a necessary act of survival. Reclaim your power, cut off the toxicity, and share your own boundary setting journey in the comments below.